Welcome. We're going to be talking about disasters and global health today. And one of the things that we want you to be able to put into perspective is based on all the things that you have learned in this class related to these different topics. When a disaster hits, what might you expect based on the different topics that are being hit and the different body systems that might be impacted? So we're going to go through that today, how it's measured, what we might expect. So one of the things that we're really hoping to push related to some of these things is being 2 weeks ready. So can you survive for 2 weeks with having 2 weeks of supply of water, 2 weeks supply of food, having shelter materials, just in case you get displaced? Imagine in an earthquake, in a tornado, do you have those materials ready? And there are going to be some issues related to that. Some people might not have the storage space to hold food and water for that long. Some people may not have the financial resources to have that amount of supplies ready. So there are overarching things that are going to influence this, but the general goal is, can you be 2 weeks ready? So when we're talking about disasters, there are lots of different ones that we may talk about. So we've spent a lot of time on, say, wildfires and some earthquakes and floods and hurricanes. However, there's lots of others that exist as well. So there could be explosions related to chemical components, for example, or landslides, or any of these other things where they have these hybrid components where, we might have this major earthquake in the Pacific Northwest that's going to impact a lot of these technological issues. So where are some of these hazardous chemicals being stored? How are they being safeguarded in case of accidents? So keep all of these in mind. When we do have some of the disasters, you can imagine that the types of injuries and deaths are going to be very different depending on kind of what they are. So if we're talking about communicable diseases, these might be some lung infections, these infections related to wounds or water contamination, which happened in Haiti, for example, after their big earthquake there. There's also non-communicable diseases. So you can see heat stroke, you can see all sorts of cardiovascular disease and asthma outcomes. We've talked a lot about that related to air quality. And then toxic exposure. So radiation illness came up in Radiation Week. You might see all sorts of different poisonings that might occur, and some of the carbon monoxide poisoning. So as generators are producing more and more, are used more and more after a disaster, for example, there might be additional exposures related to poisonings, for example, from carbon monoxide. And then finally, you have some built environment hazards. So, as buildings might collapse, or, you stepping on glass as you're trying to escape a building. So there's lots of immediate and downstream effects. And then some of those downstream impacts, like not only is it going to be displacements on housing and worse impacts on mental health, but how is all of this stress and financial insecurity kind of overlaying on all of these other things? So there can be a lot of impacts, both ones that you can see and ones that you can't. So how do we do a better job of estimating who might be at risk? So we talked previously about using the social vulnerability index as a way for initially understanding who might be at risk. And so this is a measure from the CDC that uses 15 metrics from the US Census. So it pulls these data points together, and it's a way to estimate what supplies do we need and how many people are we needed to support these individuals, and what's the best way to evacuate these individuals and recover in these communities once a disaster is over. So all of these things kind of come together, and so you can play around with it. It's an amazing site. But when you're looking more globally, how do we do this? And so when you look globally, one of the things that we're seeing is that low-income countries are going to be more vulnerable to natural disasters. And these disasters continue to build up and continue to make them poor. So this is one resource that you can see that kind of shows some of this in a big picture. And one of the things that we're going to be using to estimate vulnerability is a thing called the INFORM Index. And we're going to go through what that means. So INFORM is a methodology that is used to estimate not only what the severity of that hazard, but also how vulnerable are the people who are in that region, and then what's their ability to cope with that hazard or exposure, for example. And so there are a lot of these factors that kind of go into these things together. And there's this crazy, amazing algorithm for trying to estimate this. So when they talk about vulnerability, for example, like it's not only socioeconomic vulnerability, but also vulnerable groups. So if we're talking about socioeconomic vulnerability, for example, they pull together all of these different metrics that it can be used. So like Human Development Index and poverty indices and income inequality index. And so then that combines with, well, what's the overall exposure of these vulnerable groups, for example? So what is their access to food? What is their availability? Have they had recent issues that might, in the past 3 years, that might influence their response to this? How many young children do they have? What are the health conditions that generally exist for this population? So all of these things will kind of go together. This is another way of looking at it. So this is the Global Crisis Severity Index. So previously we looked at the Vulnerability Index, and this is the Global Crisis Severity Index. And so you can see not only what's the impact of the crisis, what are the conditions on those people, and then what's the complexity of it, and how do all of those things fit together. And what's really fascinating is that this Global Crisis Severity Index, they have beautiful spreadsheets related to this on what these big impacts are and what we might expect. So, for example, this is as of this morning. So this is from October 2020. And what you'll see is that they will give you a category, generally speaking, of what is that severity. So if it's at a 5, this is a very high severity issue that is needs to be addressed. And so then they start talking about some of the various conditions. So you can go into really go into the data and look at kind of where these impacts are happening and what the severity is and who's impacted, who's helping. And they even have now these warning systems. So before it gets, very high in terms of a global severity, what are some of these early indicators so we may be able to, step back and really kind of dive in. So the goal is, as we think about this, how can we invest in resilience? So one of the issues is that when we have this catastrophe, we want to be able to be resilient in the times of catastrophe. So often with the way that we do that is we increase the costs early up to start to prepare for these things. So when a catastrophe does happen, there's less cost and a faster recovery time down the road. But not everybody wants to increase cost prior to catastrophe. This is kind of where that rubber meets the road. So there are things called conceptual frameworks for disaster risk management. And so you probably have seen this previously in your schooling. If not, this is important. We really want you to be able to see it. So there are various stages of prevention within public health, and each of those have a specific phase for emergency management and what those disaster risk management components might be. So like as we're kind of going through, we might be trying to avoid risk in the very beginning related to primary prevention, but as we're starting to go down, we are trying to reduce that risk as we're doing preparedness. So we always love to think about what are some successful examples. And so here's some easy ways or things to think about, for example. So before a heat wave, so if you are around individuals who might be elderly, so can you increase their air conditioning? Can you increase their water and social supports? Can you check in on them, for example? So if you are at a workplace, or maybe this is even your home, that have a lot of toxins. So how can you build in hierarchy of controls by limiting amounts that are on site and restricting access and improving the storage containers, or what happens if the toxins leak? So, being able to pull these hierarchy of controls in to really kind of think about how are you going to just really minimize risk is something to think about. And also for earthquakes. And so what sort of training and disaster response can you do in advance so you can make sure that, if something happens, you know where to go, you have the supplies on hand, you know how to help others. So things to think about. So when they talk about a resilience framework, you might have these shocks or shock to the systems, and then the capacity to deal with those disturbances, you'll have certain reactions. So in a dream world, you'll bounce back better than you did before. In other places, you might bounce back. In other places, you might recover, but it's worse than before. And in other places, it might be a complete collapse. So our goal as we start to develop this is how can we build in this resilience framework so we can bounce back better in the times of a hazard or conflict or insecurity or whatever that is. And people think a lot about this. A lot about this. So as we're kind of going through some of this resilience, what does that actually look like? What are the factors that go into that? And what are they in the context of various natural hazards? So please know, as scientists are really kind of trying to pull all of these things together as a way to think about them. And if you go into the literature, there's now some meta-analyses that are starting to pull together these uh, various resilience indicators. So when you have these indices for measuring resilience, what are they measuring? Is there a consistent way that that is happening? And the answer is not necessarily. So you'll see that a lot of this, the most common one is measuring aspects related to the social environment. But there are some that, not all of them are including all of these different indicators. So for example, there are between like 2 and 235 variables that go into these various indices. And then, but, less than 2/3 or so use the same 40 variables on average, generally speaking. And about 12% of them are measuring action or steps to either mitigate in response to a disaster or prepare for a disaster. So not a lot of them necessarily do that. And then, about a fifth of them are using any sort of like sensitivity or uncertainty analysis. So as we're kind of like pulling these things together, what I hope that you see is that there's a lot of variability in measuring how resilient are we. So if in case you were wondering of like what these variables actually include, so related to social environment, we're talking about demographics, education and health, et cetera. Economic environment that kind of goes is a little bit more well understood. So lots of GDP related items there. Built environment could be like how big are the houses that people that live together? What are the household assets? These are really common, so we'll see a lot of that. So this is often like the number of renters and how many people have access to clean water are the most common things that you'll typically see. And then finally with disaster environment, so they talk about measuring disaster risk, but only about 71% of them are including some measure of the disaster hazard. So not all of them are doing that. So some of my favorite examples, actually my favorite example of all of it is the Vietnamese residents after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. So they rebuilt 90% of their homes within 1 year. So they have a wonderful sense of community that really supported their resilience and building back and hopefully building back better. Related to economic environment, so what incentives might help for incentivizing mitigation measures, or as we have all of these lack of funds, you can imagine we've seen that there are reductions to the number of building inspectors that are currently funded. So how do we support that to make sure that we have people monitoring what is happening? And then related to built environments is that you can think about it in terms of like codes, in terms of high winds, or in floodplains of restricting building in those areas. How can you really kind of support the labeling of evacuation routes and other things? So as you're kind of pulling all of these things together, I just wanted to show some examples of kind of what these things look like in terms of social resilience, economic resilience, institutional resilience, infrastructure resilience, and community capital. So some various examples of kind of how to think about these things and where those data sources arise. And to give you some framework, so San Francisco has a SPUR method. So this is their Planning and Urban Research Association. And so they're trying to figure out like how, after an earthquake, what are we wanting to do? What are the key things? So they have 30-day goals, 72-hour goals, and they're really kind of thinking about these two things in terms of that speed of recovery. So within 72 hours, they want to have the airport open and ready for emergency traffic. By 30 days, they want to have the city's schools repaired and usable and 95% of the neighborhood utilities working. They recognize that it would take a long time to get that, back online. Right now, it takes 3 years to do that. So, there are some challenges for building in those early phases. So as you kind of think about these things, what exists, what is ideal, and what might we expect given these various conditions? So when you pull these things together, this is not something that you necessarily need to do or turn in, but as you're thinking about these various disasters, you've learned a lot about topics related to environmental health. So how do you start to pull these things together? So when a disaster does strike, what might be some of the things that you might see immediately? And so those are the items in red. And then you have some, what might you expect from those issues? So if, for example, loss of habitat or human caused, you might have some mental health impacts related to either displacement from losing your home, or you can imagine that the victims and perpetrators may also still have mental health impacts from all of the stress that's associated with that fire environment. Then you can also think about in green, so what are some ways that you can either measure it or you can start to mitigate risk? So by pulling these things together, the goal is to kind of think outside the box, if you will, of like how can you start to pull these various components together so you can better prepare and be more resilient should disaster strike. So look for the patterns and trust yourself.